Okay, we'll get rolling here. I'd like to formally welcome everyone to our Hemp Growers Educational Series presented to you by Hempton Farms. Something that we wanted to go out and do an educational webinar series. However, with the COVID-19, it's really thrust all of these social webinar series into light, and frankly, a great way to create a community. And like a community, we are growing together, no pun intended, and ask all to feel free to ask questions. There is no shame in asking a challenging question, or even the proverbial don't worry about dare to be dumb, as some would say, and ask a question, because there could be someone else on the line wanting to ask it as well. So we're very casual in that. You can either type it in or come off mute and ask. We'll make sure to stop here and there through the presentation, and maybe even I'll play dumb and ask some questions to hopefully facilitate some conversations. So we have two presenters today. We have Adam Trado with Hempton Farms. He's our Vice President of Agriculture. But first, we will have Sarah Herms speak on looking at insurance and risk management consultant. As you can see here, Sarah serves as an advocate for her clients to minimize the insurance costs and risk associated with their business. Over the last 2 years, Sarah and her team have partnered with insurance carriers across the country and hemp growers across the country to develop some of the first ever crop coverage insurance for the hemp industry. Sarah is a phenomenal partner of ours and has agreed to field any calls, whether that leads to a client agent partnership or not. She is definitely an advocate for farmers awareness and farmers protection. That's what drives her in her industry, along with Adam Trado, who will be presenting following Sarah. Adam's a fourth generation farmer from Northeast Iowa, not many of them walking around. He's still actually turning dirt on his homestead that his grandfather secured as an immigrant from Germany. After studying finance at Iowa State, Adam spent a little bit of time in Europe doing a walkabout, but really doing it in a preceptorship program. Following that, he joined John Deere, which is our major manufacturer here in the Cedar Valley and Cedar Falls, Waterloo, Iowa. In 2007, while at Deere, he held various positions in supply chain, production, and operations. He left Deere in 2016 as a manager of material flow at their Horicon factory located in Wisconsin to return to farming full time. With his backgrounds in operations and commercial agriculture, Adam was a phenomenal fit and decided to join Hempton Farms to focus on field scale production and various hemp crops, focusing on cost management and ensuring profitability in a fast changing marketplace. With a heavy focus on R&D, he enjoys sharing lessons learned and collaborating with growers on economic advancements, hemp farming. So we're looking forward to having a casual yet high level agronomic and profitability review today following Sarah's presentation. Sarah, if you can take yourself off mute, I'd like to turn the presentation over to you. And again, we greatly appreciate your partnership and commitment to education of farmers across this great country. So Sarah, take it away.
Thanks so much, Corey. And mutually, I think this is a really important and powerful way to connect farmers in a budding industry, no pun intended. But there's a lot of education and knowledge sharing that needs to happen in insurance, notwithstanding, because there's a lot changing. And so I'm going to run through this, but like Corey said, if please feel free to jump in and hopefully we'll navigate the technology well. But if there are questions or other information or knowledge that you all are able to share, please, this is a co-collaborative effort here. So I am going to try to keep this quick because insurance is probably not the most fun of the subjects being discussed today, but an important one to keep in mind. So I'm going to run through this, but again, for educational purposes only. If there are particular questions that you all have, please feel free. I'll have my contact information there at the end. Feel free to reach out. I do want to just quickly touch on property and casualty insurance considerations. Most of you, I'm assuming, have some sort of farming background or some sort of operations um, currently going. And so one thing to keep in mind, I kind of talked through some of the considerations here, but one thing to keep in mind, there are some insurance carriers that still have a hemp exclusion on their policies. And so my recommendation would be to reach out to your current agent or broker and make sure that you're with a carrier that has some sort of carved back provision for hemp operations, because the last thing you'd want to happen is to have some sort of property or casualty claim and then the claim is denied because you are growing hemp. But more and more we're seeing this change every day, and it's just insurance is a lagging industry. So there's more and more primary markets that are getting on board and offering coverage for hemp growers. And then I put on here, all the typical property casualty equipment coverage. One thing to keep in mind as a farmer, I do want to add there on the end is seed quality. And there are a lot of different claims. You can do a Google search and see all the litigation that's happened in this industry over the last year, especially. But it's really important from my perspective to find the right partners in this industry. And so I guess a little mutual plug back to Hempton. At the end of the day, we're going to talk through insurance for the crop, but none of that's going to cover seed genetics. Um, and so ultimately, it's finding the right partner and doing your diligence and having the right contracts in place to protect yourself. So transitioning over to crop insurance, there are a few different options that are available, both federal and private, and so I'm going to talk through both. So on the federal crop insurance side, for those that are familiar, the first option that rolled out from the federal government was a whole farm revenue protection policy, or just including hemp within that policy. Not going to go into detail on this. It's great if you have multiple crops and it can protect your total revenue of your farm operation. It is difficult to qualify for. So again, not going to go into huge detail there, but I want, in case someone brings that up, yes, that is available. I'm happy to have more conversations. The typical crop insurance that you all are probably familiar with is a multi-peril crop insurance, MPCI, that's based on the actual production history of the crop on your farm. And so this was the first year that the federal government was offering this type of coverage for hemp. So it operated the same way for the most part as crop insurance, federal crop insurance for corn, soy, wheat, etc. The deadline for this was March 15th. So we've passed the deadline. And this being the first year, it was only available in some states and in some cases only some counties within those states. So the good news is that this coverage is now available, and we anticipate that it will roll out to a lot more states and counties next year. And I can not, again, because the coverage has now, the deadline to apply has passed, I'm not going to go into great detail, but I do want to make known that this year, in order to qualify, you had to have 1 year of crop history for hemp. And so thinking through how you can position yourself for the most amount of coverage next year, I highly recommend looking into the documentation requirements in order to qualify for this coverage next year, assuming that they will again require that 1 year of prior history. And then the other item to keep in mind is that in some counties, they won't allow coverage for a crop on a location where certain crops were grown before. So in some cases, you cannot get coverage for a hemp crop on the same plot of land that you grew hemp last year. So again, it varies from county to county, state to state, but looking ahead, this is a great coverage option to get. And so as best as you can position yourself to qualify for this next year, it's worth looking into what the qualifications were this year. For those, again, now that we've passed the deadline for the federal crop insurance, there are still private crop insurance options available for this year that don't have as stringent of requirements. So the first one that I want to go over that from my perspective, is the most comprehensive that one of the most comprehensive and at least the most cost effective, is a weather bundle insurance package that covers hail, wind, fire, lightning, and smoke. And there is also add-on coverage available for vandalism. So this product is available to you regardless of where you are in the country and regardless of what your history is. And the cost of the policy, that of the ones that we've placed, the rate has come in between 2.5% and 8% of the total limit, and you can get up to $15 million of coverage. So to back out of that, if you were to purchase a $1 million policy, it would cost between $30,000 and $80,000 for that $1 million policy. And it operates almost like a property policy. So if you had a hail claim, then they would have an adjuster come out to your field, and they would adjust it on in the field, and the payout would be based on what your input costs are, and that's kind of how we back into the limit. So that's available to everyone this year. Crop hail is generally available, and again, a lot of farmers probably are familiar with that. We've seen coverage up to and limits up to 10,000 per acre. And then there's another type of coverage called parametric that can cover for a lot of precipitation and temperature related concerns of rain, drought, excess heat, frost, etc. It's typically more expensive, but good. There's it's a good option for those that have those types of concerns. So all in all, recommendations, it really starts with figuring out what your primary concerns are from a risk profile. Are you concerned about hail? Are you concerned about wind? Is excess heat or drought a concern? And from there, ideally, it's starting with the federal subsidized crop insurance, and then building on with any sort of private products. Because we've passed the window on the federal crop, at this point, it's exploring which of these private products are the best option. Is there a way to bundle them together to get the right type of coverage for you, and working within the budget that you have? And then I have document your crop. So again, as best as you can, position yourself to be able to apply for the federal crop insurance for next year. So those are my recommendations. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions that come up now or in the future. That's my cell phone number. And then we've got an email dedicated to hemp questions that might come in. So with that, I will hand it back over to Corey and Adam unless there are any questions.
Thank, Yeah, let's just wait here a second, Sarah, and see if there's any questions. Obviously, and this is Corey Hinkey. Obviously, crop insurance is the lifeblood of a performa and of risk mitigation for any agricultural crop and endeavor. What have been some kind of standard boilerplate questions you've been getting? If you had to say the top one or two questions that fill up your inbox daily, what do you think some of those have been?
So one that comes to mind that many people ask is, can you cover a hot crop if the THC goes above the 0.3%? And the answer is no. Unfortunately, there's no insurance policy that covers that. And one, again, that's where it comes back to the genetics are paramount of working with the right genetics providers. And then in some instances, we've seen, one farmer that's used the same genetics year after year up in Minnesota, and there's one season where the temperature spiked above a certain degree for a number of days, and then the crop went hot. And so, and maybe you guys can get into that, but there's some concerns around the weather of temperature and drought and stress on the plant, and that's where some of those parametric policies that I mentioned, they could pay out if the weather if the temperature sustains above a certain temperature for a number of days. And that's kind of a workaround option if that's a concern of yours, that that policy would pay out and essentially cover what it would cost to replant the crop, or um, at least position you to replant for the following year. So that's one that's come up. Um, Trying to think. It's really one of the things that's been interesting for me is just how varied the needs are of farmers around the country. And again, it's really dependent on what the localized weather patterns are, whether or not hail is a concern, whether or not wind's a concern. Um, Again, ideally, that federal multi-peril crop insurance product is great because it covers the wide spectrum of risks and is ensuring what the total yield is. But the limits on that have been low for some farmers, so it really depends. And that's where our goal has been to help farmers develop some sort of customized solution because again, there's a lot of different varied needs
Yeah.
out there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, sorry to put you on the spot there. You did a wonderful job, not only through your presentation, but handling that fast break outlet pass
For
there.
sure.
Without the March Madness, have to do a little bit of basketball referencing. All right. So thank you so much, Sarah. And again, if you didn't get her contact information, feel free to reach out to us. We will make sure to put you in contact with her. She's excited to be a resource and even do one-off webinars with any folks in your rural communities. As we know, sometimes it's best to get together to gather the information collectively and move forward. So moving on in our presentation today, Adam Trado, as mentioned before, the Vice President of Agriculture for Hempton Farms, will be going through his presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to jump off and fire away. Adam, are you off mute and ready to roll?
I am ready to roll. Sarah, thanks again for joining us today. And Corey, thanks for the quick introduction here. Like Corey mentioned, if you guys have any questions as I go through this, I'm going to try and pause for questions periodically, but at the same time, if I get too excited about something and I don't, feel free to raise your hand or jump in and just ask. We're happy to answer questions along the way. I'll also warn everybody, I've got a dog, a boxer here that was sleeping all morning, and in the last 5 minutes as Sarah was presenting, decided she wanted to wake up and play. So if you hear some whining in the background, I promise I'm not a bad dad dog, but I've got a bowl full of peanut butter here for her right now. Hopefully she stays at bay, but if you hear something in the background, I'll try and keep her down. So moving on, just in review, for those of you that were able to join our first 3 or 4 webinars, we started a few weeks back with policy from Alan Freeman. And then we carried that on with economics from Dr. Ray Massey from the University of Missouri. And he talked about the profitability for the various forms of hemp that are currently being grown. And then Justin Kay talked about agronomics, so fertilizer rates, field selection, that type of thing. As we kind of look back in hindsight, what we wanted to do today was start to put this all together for you guys. And in bold, I put what I think is probably one of the most critical keys to success in 2020, and that's going to be aggressively managing your financials for your operation and for your grow. So we'll talk about that here in a little bit. That's going to come down to a marketing plan, an agronomic plan, and then analyzing net profits and return on investments and any risk that you're willing to accept. But we want to walk you through that, how we approach that here at Hempton. But before we do, I want to kind of go back, and when I listened to the presentations that our previous 3 presenters gave, and also as a grower that's been through this for a few seasons now, what I kind of think are kind of the critical few things that they shared the last couple of weeks. So I'll start with field selection. So understanding what type of soil you have or have access to, if you've got a couple of different fields that you're trying to decide on, that's going to be very critical. And by soil type, initially we're looking at kind of the 3 soil properties that are inherent in any soil, and that's the amount of clay, the amount of silt, and the amount of sand. For those of you that are experienced growers, you know that clay is is extremely fine at a microscopic level. It packs together very well. That's why if you pick up clay and mold it in your hand, it's easy to clump it together. And that's great for holding nutrients, but it's not great for shedding water, which hemp doesn't like. Somewhere in between is silt. That's a little bit larger than clay at the microscopic level, but the particles don't necessarily stick together. So when you see erosion in a field from either wind or water, it's typically a silty field. And on the other end of the spectrum is sand. So sand is much coarser than clay and even more so than silt. So it's great for drainage and allowing water to move through the soil profile, but it doesn't hold the nutrients that we need to support the crop. So there's all kinds of different groups of clay, silt, and sand, and the best one that you're going to find or want to try and grow your hemp on is called loam. By definition, loam is about 40% silt and sand and about 20% clay, and that's going to be the ideal mix of those through macro properties to grow your hemp crop. But we recognize that not every piece of soil out there is going to be that exact makeup. Certainly doesn't have to be, but that's what you want to try and target as a loam. So if you're looking at different grow zones or fields in your area, one thing we would recommend doing is using what's a free resource by the USDA. It's called the USDA Web Soil Survey. And I just put an example of a field that we took a look at last week here in Iowa. We can walk you through that if that's something you want help with. You can also purchase these services from people like Surety and others. Personally, I wouldn't recommend doing that. You can get the same level of detail off the USDA Web Soil Survey. So if you have questions on that or want help walking through that, we can either do that one-on-one, or if somebody really wanted to, we could hold on at the end of the call later today and go through something like that. Once you understand or hopefully find a field that has at least some percentage of loam in it, the next thing that you're going to want to focus on or make sure you have is good drainage, either natural or artificial. Again, like I mentioned, hemp does not like a lot of water, especially early in the season. So you want to make sure that you've got the ability to drain water away from that seed as it's in the early stages of its growth. Speaking out of the other corner of my mouth, later in the season, hemp does like a decent amount of water. So if you're in a region that doesn't necessarily receive natural patterns of rainfall, you're going to want to make sure you have access to irrigation, either with an overground pivot or with an underground drip tape. So once you understand where you're going to grow, the next step would be getting soil fertility tests. So these fertility tests are different than the soil structure that we just talked about on the previous slide. When you pull a fertility test, it's going to tell you what amount of macronutrients are currently in the soil. So the macronutrients are generally considered nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then it's going to also identify the level of micronutrients that are in the soil. So I've listed 3 here. There's far more than that, but 3 of the more common for really any type of crop production is going to be sulfur, calcium, and magnesium. The other thing that your soil test is going to tell you is your soil pH. So for hemp, we want to be somewhere between 6 to 7.5, and your soil test will indicate that. If you're wondering where to get a soil fertility test, these are things that you have to pay for. Unfortunately, they're not super expensive. Definitely going to be worth your investment prior to growing this season. If you don't know who to contact, generally your local extension office is going to have recommendations in your grow area, or you can talk to just about any ag retailer out there, and they'll generally provide that service for you as well. Fertility tests are important because they will drive the fertility plan for your crop. So once you understand the existing nutrient levels on that piece of soil that you're looking at growing on, you're going to use that to develop your fertility plan. The research and the publications that are out there vary significantly right now, and I put a table at the bottom of this slide to kind of help you understand that. This one's just looking at the 3 macronutrients we talked about, so nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and you can see several different sources there, some private, some are university studies. But nitrogen, for example, the studies out there right now will suggest anywhere from a minimum of 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre to as much as 178. So the data out there varies widely. Again, if you are looking for a resource in your geographic region, we would recommend you talk to your local extension office. If you're not getting anywhere with any of that, at a very generic level, I typically tell people plan for at least 150 pounds of nitrogen, 40 pounds of phosphorus, and 90 pounds of potassium, and if needed, probably 17 pounds of sulfur as well. So weed, pest, and disease plan. So right now there are limited herbicides, pesticides, or fungicides that are labeled for hemp. There are a number of them kind of moving through the channels right now for approval. Hoping some of those will be available for this grow season, but at this point we just don't know. And so essentially, even if you're growing hemp on conventional ground, you're essentially going to grow it organically. So when doing that, there are definitely things that you need to consider. One example would be weed pressure history. If you're planning to put your hemp on a field that is, heavily grassed currently, or sees a lot of volunteer weeds because of drift from a local wooded area or something like that, probably not going to be the best spot for your hemp, because then you're going to be battling that weed pressure all season long. Prior crop is another thing that you want to consider. So from a fungal perspective, hemp is susceptible to a lot of the same molds that soybeans are. And I don't remember if Sarah touched on this today or not, but from an insurance perspective, insurance companies will not insure a hemp crop going on a prior soybean field for that very reason, because they are concerned about that disease pressure. So doesn't mean you can't do it. In Wisconsin last year, we grew some hemp on a field that was previous soybeans. We didn't have any fungal pressure through the season, and we knew going into the season that the soybean fields had never had that pressure either, but definitely something you're going to want to consider. Also, from a weed control plan, spacing is going to be super critical in terms of your intra-row and inter-row spacing. Inter-row is really the spacing between the rows of crops, and then intra-row is within each row, how far apart are each of the plants. And just as a quick example, this is an eye chart, but this kind of gives you a feel for, on the left-hand side, your population, and on the top, your row width spacing. What's the spacing going to be between plants intra-row? You'll see things shaded, red, green, and yellow. I would try to be in that green band if you can. That's going to basically square up your plants. So in theory, if it's 52 inches between rows, it's going to be 52 inches between plants within the row. That offers the most amount of sunlight exposure to your plant and generally results in the highest yield of CBD. If that's not a possibility, anything where the intra-row spacing gets tighter and tighter is going to be preferred, especially when you're looking for the crop to canopy and naturally suppress any weeds that might be trying to come through. So this is all stuff that we'll probably post some of this on our website if you want to get these data sets. But if you guys have any questions as you're planning your grow for 2020, we're happy to kind of walk you through all of this stuff. So putting it all together, again, I talked in my first slide about aggressively managing financials in 2020. That's going to be key because, as many of you have probably heard, there's more and more supply coming online every day. And so actively managing your costs is going to be critical to make sure that you can still be profitable at whatever the market's willing to bear. And three things that we try to put together for growers if they're interested are a financial plan, an agronomic plan, and then an operational plan. So you see an example of that here on the right-hand side of the slide, and I'm actually going to jump over to the tool that we use to do that. And I'll try to walk through this, first of all, left to right, and then top to bottom. If you have any questions, again, I'll be pausing here briefly, but please don't be afraid to speak up if you do. So first of all, at the very top, we've got some selection criteria. So client, farm, and field. For most, if this is your first grow and you're just doing one field, it's not going to apply. But for some of our larger clients that are growing on 3 or 4 different fields or in different regions, we have the ability to take the profitability down to the field level, so they can see if they're making money on one and losing on the other. Below that, we have what we kind of consider the vital few. So how many acres are in this plan set? What are your total costs going to be? What do you expect your gross profit to be based on current market conditions? And then resulting in that is your net profit. And then we do have a section for crop assets and material assets. Typically, most of our growers don't utilize that section. We do on our own farms, but then also any operating loans that you're going to need to carry to make your grow happen. So I'm going to start with this section right here, the crop proformas and agronomics. Before I do, are there any questions up until this point? Okay, if not, so again, a bit of an eye chart, so allow me to walk you through it. What this section is doing is it's comparing several different crops. and how they compare financially. So you see at the top, we have CBD biomass. We have a column for CBD floral, a column for hemp grain, hemp fiber, and then a traditional corn and soybean field here in Iowa. Also, the planned acres for each. So 392 acres for the biomass, 41 for the floral. Right now, this particular client isn't looking at anything for hemp grain, hemp fiber, corn, or soybeans. So first we take a peek at production cost per acre. Again, this is just a dashboard summary that you're seeing right here. There's a lot that's rolling into this. So we'll typically sit with growers and try to understand what machines do you have access to, if they're willing to share how much they're paying for those machines or renting for those machines. That's all stuff that we're going to plug in here. If they don't want to give us the details, that's completely fine too. We can just put a lump sum in there if they know what their machine costs are. But that's going to be anything from a tractor to a planter to a tillage piece of equipment. If you're operating on GPS or any level of precision ag, getting all those components in there so we really understand what your total machine costs per acre are. That would also include any fuel costs, any repair costs, or anything to that sort associated with those given machines. From a manpower perspective, very similar to machines, what full-time equivalents do you have on your operation? That might be you, that might be people you hire for you. And then also what part-time equivalents do you have in terms of seasonal labor to come in and either harvest your crop or plant your crop or care for your crop. Pretty sizable difference, as you can see here, between CBD biomass and CBD floral. Floral just tends to be very much hands-on. If you recall, I think it was Dr. Massey's presentation a few weeks back. He said they typically estimate 240 man hours per acre of CBD floral grown. So our experience isn't quite that high, but it is definitely labor intensive relative to some of the other crops. Material, this is probably where the bulk of the time has to be spent. So this is going to be your seed quantities that you're applying per acre multiplied by the cost of that seed. Similar with fertilizers. So any nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium fertilizers that you're putting down. If you are laying plastic, either with a direct seeding planter or with a transplanter, it's going to roll in the plastic costs for your operation. Again, very similar to labor. CBD floral, at least the model that we employ, tends to be quite a bit more cost intensive because of the amount of plastic that it's using, and plastic's very expensive when it comes down to these grows. So, but again, anything, whether it's seed, fertilizers, chemicals, again, not a whole lot of chemicals labeled for hemp right now, but anything like that, that's going to roll into this section. And then miscellaneous, that's going to be any type of business unit overheads. If you want to include training or travel, whether it's cars, hotels, whatever it might be. Generally, the biggest cost drivers in this particular section are rent and or land costs, and then also any insurance that you might be purchasing, which is part of the reason we wanted to have Sarah on today. So that's going to comprise your miscellaneous section. So adding those 4 buckets together, we get our total costs. If clients are interested, one thing we try to manage here at Hempton is the amount or percent of spend quoted. Really, for probably your own awareness, if you do have the luxury of a commercial lender or an ag lender that's going to be loaning you money for hemp, you can also take this to them and explain, look, I've got my crop, 100% quoted. Ideally, at this point in the season, you want to be as close to 100% as you can. So there's not going to be a huge deviation from the total cost that you're planning for. So next, I'll get into production revenue, but before I do, any questions on production cost per acre? If not, the next thing is trying to estimate the production revenue. Through the course of the season, we will go out and take a look at the fields and, using some anecdotal data really, or some empirical as well, but based on plant populations that are emerging, based on flowering stages and different things like that, we'll try to estimate the yield for any type of crop to the best of our ability. Right now, weighted average across our farms for biomass, as you can see here, we're planning on about 1,955 pounds of yield per acre. That's based on our experience in the last couple of years. We're pretty confident that we can hit that level in the regions that we're growing in. CBD floral obviously is quite a bit less because you are only using a small portion of the plant relative to biomass. Generally, biomass is going to include any flower and any leaves. That's where the bulk of your CBD content is. When you're selling or growing for flower, it's just going to be the flower that propagate on the plants. So the yield's going to be considerably less. That being said, the price point on flower is quite a bit higher than biomass, and you can start to see some of that filter down here at the very tail end of this section. Contracted units, so anything that you can do to get a contract in hand early on should give you some confidence as you're growing, and or your lender some confidence as you're growing. Right now we don't have anything in this particular client example contracted for biomass, and just a handful of pounds per acre contracted for the floral. So once we've done that, the gross revenue per acre is a product of the contracted units times the contracted price, and also the uncontracted units times the open market price. So the open market price, again, that's the piece that I talked about earlier. We're seeing a lot of downward pressure as supply is coming online. So that's where you're really going to want to manage your contracts and try and get something in writing as early as you can to mitigate your risk. And then you'll see that metric right here. So the percent contracted, so you understand, what you want to be driving towards. Obviously, the closer we can get to 100%, the better off we're going to be. Below that, just some traditional financial metrics. So return on investment. This is where I always kind of like to pause. And, we hear a lot of traditional corn and soybean growers saying, I've heard the price of CBD biomass is plunging very quickly. That's true. But again, if you can aggressively manage your costs, and that's what we want to walk you through, we still see a pretty sizable return. So for biomass right now, we're estimating 39% return on investment for this particular client. Floral obviously much higher given that price point, but floral probably also comes with more risk than biomass. But comparing that to the traditional crops that we're growing here in Iowa, for example, corn and soy, as of today, we're seeing about a 9% return on corn, and I think right now this is still based on yesterday's price point. I know beans were up a little bit this morning, but we're actually losing money on any acre of soybean that we were planting in Iowa as of yesterday. So returns are still pretty promising, we feel. The next thing we're going to look at is break-even price. So if the market continues to trend downward, how far can it go down before you're losing money based on the inputs that you have up here for your costs? Or looking at it a different way, if price were to remain constant and we had a catastrophic yield year for whatever reasons, weather or otherwise, what's the least amount of yield that you can accept and still break even? If we have data coming off of our machines, at least for us, would be a GPS equipment that's capturing yield data as we move through the field. That's recorded here. So a 5-year average, a 5-year min, and a 5-year max for each of the respective crops, and then insurance coverage. So like we talked about with Sarah earlier, in this example, we don't have any insurance factored in, but if you're able to secure some insurance either federally or privately, that's going to offset your loss potential that you see right here, or your net profit minimum. And then net profit maximum, if you had an outstanding year, price did, all the right things, and you had one of the best yields ever, this is what you could expect to receive per acre on the high end. So before I move to this next section down here, any questions on either cost per acre, revenue per acre, how we're rolling that up? Okay, if not, again, going back to, this is kind of the agronomic section, and at least on this dashboard summary, we're only looking at the macronutrients as well as sulfur. So again, N, P, and K, and then S. This is going to take a look at all the different fertilizers that you're putting on your land and tell you how many actual pounds of nitrogen you're putting on. In this particular example, it looks like we're using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different fertilizers. Generally, a fertilizer is going to consist of a composition of N, P, and K. So it's not going to be all N, it's not going to be all P, or it's not going to be all K. And it's important that you understand how that rolls up in aggregate, so you know exactly how many pounds of each of those macronutrients you're applying per acre, and then how many you're potentially removing based on the yields that you expect to receive. So it'll start to highlight deficiencies here, for example. So right now, looks like our fertilizer plan for CBD biomass is only putting on about 12 pounds of P or phosphorus. And we expect, based on the best university data that we have, that we'll probably remove closer to 32 pounds per acre. That's bad in two ways. Number one, especially if you're renting your land, your landlord will be upset if you're essentially borrowing nutrients from them for free. But probably more importantly for you, it's going to limit your yield if you're not putting on adequate macronutrients. Any questions on this short agronomic section before I jump into the next section?
Adam, this is Corey Hinkie. As I'm looking through here, and I know we've had a lot of discussions, I kind of want to go back up to the top a little bit. You might have to take off your John Deere hat and shelter your stock options there. But talk a little bit about machine power and some of the things that you have walked through on versus renting versus owning versus collaboration. I see that input's up there a little bit high on the higher side. Like, what are some recommendations as you have for folks as they're looking through? And if this is something you want to touch base on later, that's fine. Just wanted to throw something out there.
No, I think that good question, Corey. That's a good segue into my next section here. So capacity planning and execution. So one thing that we recommend you take a look at, the machines that you are potentially investing in and or already own, how many acres can you cover with those existing machines or those investing machines? I think one good example here is you see application, and I think in this client's example, it's a high boy sprayer. Looking at a large Hagie 120-foot boom, that sprayer's got the capacity to cover 22,000 acres per year. But based on the acres that they're planting, they really only have demand for it on 3,500 acres. In a corporate world, I think we would talk about right sizing that asset. So do you really need to be buying a machine with 22,000 of acres of capacity when you only have demand of 3,500 acres? And the answer is probably no. And so then it comes down to kind of a make versus buy decision. Again, buying would be, giving you this capacity. Making would be having that capacity, but buying would just be essentially hiring a local ag retailer with a sprayer or a custom applicator in your neighborhood and doing it at a much cheaper price. So I think in this example, we can get into the details if people want to see it, but I think the costs for spraying work out to around $7 or $8 per acre. At least in this corner of Iowa, typically you can hire spraying done for probably around $6.50 an acre. So in this case, it's going to be more cost advantageous to just purchase those services as opposed to actually buying the equipment yourself. As you start to fine tune, I guess, the plan versus the demand, if you're making the right decisions, obviously your machine costs are going to come down, and similar with your manpower costs. So there's a lot we could go into here right now, but it's kind of comes down to each unique operation and individual. And so if that's something that you want help with analyzing, again, we're certainly happy to do that. That tends to take a little bit longer, and we probably ask some pretty probing questions. Some people aren't always comfortable sharing that. But again, if you're willing to share that level of detail with us, we'll happily put this together so that where you need to target your capacity to minimize your costs, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question, Corey?
Yes, thank you.
So that's on the machine capacity side, very similar for manpower capacity. Right now, this particular client really only has a handful of people identified. Only one is actually hired right now. And then if you start to look at, the various operations that you're going to incur as a grower, where are you going to be short? So transplanting, for example, right now, only have plant capacity of 40 hours per day, and you're going to need 100. So at that point, we'd recommend going out and finding local labor or just some part-time seasonal labor to kind of meet your capacity burst there, if you will. So again, this week I could spend all day on this particular piece. This tends to get pretty complicated, and unless people have questions on this right now, these tend to be kind of more one-off conversations. But certainly encourage anybody that's interested in understanding more of that or helping us or having us help walk through that with you. Don't be afraid to reach out later today. And then at the very bottom, again, if you're willing to share, or get a feel for cash flow, right now, this particular client is adequately financed. So you don't see any red down below here. But if there wasn't any financing available, or they didn't have anything secured, it would start to show, relative to your existing cash, when you're going to run out of cash and when you're going to need a burst of operating capital to keep your operation moving. So realize this is an eye chart. Again, having been through this myself, these are things that planning tools, I guess, that I wish I would have had, in my first year grow. There are definitely other tools out there that you can pay for. Conservice comes to mind, Granular comes to mind. Those are both great tools, phenomenal tools actually, but they cost money. So if you're looking to try and mitigate your cost in year one, maybe that's not something you want to do until you understand, if you want to stay in hemp long term. So again, if those aren't tools that you're using and or have access to, we're happy to provide this tool to help you with your first year grow. The other thing that, there's tons of data that we can generate from this. So this particular client, based on what they're planning, the acres they're planning, here's how many seeds they're going to need to support that. Here's how many transplants they would need to support that acreage. When you talk about the fertilizer plan, here's how many tons of ATS, which is generally a sulfur source, they're going to need to purchase, so on and so forth. So it gives you kind of a calculator of exactly what you're going to need to make your crop happen. And then again, at the very bottom here too, you see drip tape and plastic. If you're going for more of that floral boutique model, that's going to take a significant amount of plastic and drip tape. And if you're not familiar with how to calculate that, we can do that for you through this tool. So any questions on anything I've shared here with the planning tool?
I've got a question.
Sure.
It's about, well, my MU extension office down here in Missouri classifies hemp CBD biomass as the main revenue producer. They have a rate of similarly to your floral at 24,000 per acre revenue. I'm wondering what you define the difference between CBD biomass and CBD floral as.
So I'm assuming I'd be interested in that presentation. If it's the one that Dr. Massey shared, he was actually, and I think he shared this that day, he was using some older price points on the CBD biomass. So biomass has fallen precipitously. I mean, a year ago at this time, you could probably sell per point per pound, you could probably get $3, $4, maybe even $5. Today, that's fallen to about 60 cents. So, and that's fallen very quickly over the last couple of months. So if they're using, data that's even a month or two old, that would probably be a big change or driver. As an example, I guess right here, where are we at? We're calculating $3 on the open market price. If we were to change that and go back to, levels a year ago, well, let's say $10 even. That's going to change pretty quickly your net profit per acre. So I don't know for sure. I'd be happy to look at that presentation with you, but I would guess that they're using some old biomass price points. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Maybe I can email you a scan of this worksheet that I have.
Yeah, please do. I'd love to see it.
Okay.
So I noticed you had historical pricing in there for CBD. Do you guys have anything similar in your tool or available around CBG or any of the other components?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's a great question. I don't have a good pricing source for CBG right now. Corey, I don't know if you'd have anything like that you've been tracking. I personally have not grown any CBG yet, and it's one thing that I should probably add up here so that we can compare the relative returns between those crops. But I don't have a good pricing source for that at this point. Generally, my sources for CBD biomass and CBD floral have been one of three things: either panic or there's a hemp benchmarks, or otherwise just inventory. A lot of the brokering flower companies telling me.
Adam, you're breaking up pretty good here for a second. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Is that any better?
We'll find out when you keep talking.
All right. Hopefully that's better. So no, to answer your question, I don't have a good source on CBG pricing. Corey, do you have any idea what it's selling for?
There's just too many variables to put a blanketed cost in there, but I will tell you that depending if you're direct to retailer or going through a distribution network, it can vary as much as for good quality CBG flower from 350 up to 450 depending on the good quality, down to $200, even less. Some if you go on a lot of message boards and chat boards, you'll see that if it's highly seeded and doesn't have good notes and things that the buyer is looking for, can be $100, up to 450. It just ranges so greatly with no consistent board or consistent measurement. I will tell you, in speaking to one of my good friends in extraction with UCAN, that today they were saying they believe what they're paying for is 50 to 60 cents a point per pound for CBD biomass. That's from a real live living breathing extractor.
Can you repeat that last data point again, the CBG extraction?
The CBG, yeah, there's a lot of variables that go into it, whether it's total THC compliant versus Delta 9 compliant, how seeded or unseeded the flower is, how larvae it is, how big the buds are. I'm going to give you a range just because this is being recorded.
Yeah. The extraction, the very final component there, you said on the extraction component.
Yes, 50 to 60 cents per point per pound. So however much CBD you have in, a lot of people will say things like 50 to 60 cents per point per pound, exiting out at 10% or 15% CBD, meaning they will say it's 50 cents a point per pound, exiting at 10%. That would be your $5 per pound if you had up to 10% CBD. And to give you an idea, when Adam said the market is dropping, that same equation last year at this time would be anywhere from $4.50 per point per pound. So you can see where it's just dropped tremendously.
Okay, thank you.
Stephanie, do we have any questions that came in through the comment section?
No, we don't have any on the chat. I think everybody's just asking outright, which is great.
Perfect. Any other questions that have come up before we move on?
Hi, this is Tasha.
Yeah.
One more question on the CBG. Are you seeing a lot of your guys' farmers growing any of it, or I don't see a huge market for it yet, but just curious what you guys are seeing.
I can answer that, Sarah. So much of the CBD market, which is really a cannabinoid market, is driven by perception, and a lot of the folks looking for differentiation are definitely sliding into CBG, plus of its inherent medical benefits. Is some people with the heavy relaxation and truthfully, CBG was a really big component when the big vape market hit. A lot of people were wanting that. But the farmers are looking to do that because it is trending, but it also, the CBG strands also drive down the total THC much greater than a high CBD strand. I don't want to say much greater, but that's what their intent and their genetic design. So some people feel it provides them a little bit of protection and risk mitigation versus a traditional CBG or CBD strand.
Thank you.
Good questions. Any others before I move on? Okay, if not, the one thing that I didn't really talk about, whether you're buying our genetics or somebody else's, seed placement is going to be critical, or I should say genetic placement. So up on our screen here, we've got a handful of our genetics. I'll drop to the next slide. And I don't want to go into these in detail today because, again, to me, genetic selection is very dependent on field and fertility and geographic region. But if you're looking for suggestions on where we would place our genetics relative to your grow zone or your field or your fertility, those are part of the reasons we're offering tools like this, so that we can make sure that we're putting a product on your ground that's going to give you the most chance of success or the highest yield. So if you do have any questions on genetics, we're happy to answer those today. Again, right here, you've seen some of our more popular ones, but this really needs to be kind of a one-off, grower discussion to make sure that we're advising the right crop for your particular situation. That being said, Corey, I don't know if you want to talk through orders or anything to that extent, or if people have questions on pricing or genetics, we're happy to open it up for additional questions here.
Oh, while folks are coming off mute and thinking of some questions, I just want to reiterate what the point that you just hit on and also shed a little light on it. Outside of Adam, our genetics and our the direction of our Department of Agriculture here at Hempton Farms is driven by our second generational cannabis grower, which is very difficult to find someone that's had that much experience and seen that much genetic reproduction. And we are happy to connect you with both Adam and Jolene. It's two names, not Jolene as one word, it's Jolene. And really dive into what your goals are is extremely important. Where you're planting, kind of your game plan going into it. The 5 P's of planning definitely come into play here. And we want to be a partner of yours, and not necessarily from the transactional standpoint, but as you're growing in different elevations, as you're growing in different climates, different soils, access to water is different. If you're going to be planting seeds versus seedlings versus clones, Adam's a 4th generational row crop farmer. There are so many lessons that he knows and so many farmers on here know to avoid without even thinking. As I'm oftentimes reminded by my friends in the agriculture department, they have forgotten more about agriculture than I will ever learn. And so we are a resource, and we truly do want to learn from each other. I think I've had many of smart individuals in this industry, and as this industry continues to grow and change, it's not necessarily about hitting the lottery this year. It's more about surviving and advancing and learning and continuing to be able to implement this into a viable crop rotation for some folks. And so we do not view any companies as competitors. And if you did have selected another genetic provider, we want to watch and learn. Joint ventures are created every day. Partnerships are formed every day. It's for so much of us, and kind of our culture as a company is, we're never worried about who we're going to make money with. We're always worried about who we're going to lose money with. And what I mean by that is trust and vet and verify, and do your due diligence and share what you learn out there, as long as we'll share what we learn out there. The resources are fragmented at best. So we just, again, want to continue to be an asset to you. So we have a team that's anxious and ready to jump on. We can do these calls. We can do one-off calls. Who knows how quickly we can all jump back on airplanes, but I know my team in general is itching to get back out there and see some agriculture in different parts of the country. So up on here on your screen are our genetic pricing. Adam's pro forma that he has put together is something that we would like to offer with commitment to seeds. And if seeds not there, we can talk with you on one-off on some sort of contractual partnership, which is much more common in farm consultation across the spectrum. So shouldn't be a new conversation. But again, it's about R&D and resource development and best systems of standard operating procedures going forward. So I think unless we want to pause here a minute, does anyone on the call have a question?
Hey, this is
Yeah,
Tasha. I have one more question.
Yes.
Do you guys help with processing or?
We are in active conversations with processors. Frankly, with the amount of material that's down, and thankfully with new emerging markets coming on, we can certainly introduce you to these processors, and we've been vetting hard for a long year to find out who are some players and who are some people that we would send our own material for. We'd be happy to share those one off with you. Do you have a relationship with processors, or are you a processor yourself?
No, I'm not. I'm a farmer.
And where are you located?
We're outside of St. Louis, Missouri.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
this is Joseph Purnell. Question on the CBD clones. Have you seen where the price is going down on them any, or does it seem to be stabilized?
The pricing is in the whole industry. The pricing's really interesting. I mean, the markets themselves, traditional and non-traditional, moves on perception and supply and demand. But our industry is hyper sensitive to a few things that play into the price, and that is, frankly, the life cycle of a company, where they're at. You tend to see more established, better early moving companies have an established price and are staying true to that. And some companies that are needing to return quick profits are certainly dropping theirs. We have seen some CBD seeds fluctuate. We have changed our pricing to reflect that. The CBG seeds are staying strong, but specifically the clones. And we had an experience last year where we ordered our clones, couldn't get them into the ground because of the weather, lost our spot in line, had to come back, and they increased the price. So you see clones tend to be kind of more like just a more traditional commodity, and just on demand. So right now the clones seem to be staying steady across the board. Just out of curiosity, Joe, are you seeing pricing indicative of what we share here, or higher or lower?
Seeing higher prices, especially I'm in the Carolina area, and you're seeing prices $6 and $7, some even $8 for clones.
Yeah, $8 was probably more the 2020. Adam, we even saw some out there as we were looking to diversify, and we did a tremendous amount of R&D last year, so we were really diversifying outside of our own genetics. But I felt like some got as high as $12 last year. Adam, do you remember?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I saw that high, but I mean, 7 or 8 wasn't uncommon last year. To Corey's point, I think the market's fallen, so I think the seed sellers are going to have to adjust, ourselves included. So, unless they can say that it's THC free or something like that, I'd have a hard time paying that price.
Yeah, I was going to say it kind of seems like some prestigious pricing. I would drill into that, and we'd love to be your clone provider. So hopefully we can strike up a conversation further to that.
All right, thanks.
Any other questions? Even if it's something I didn't cover, machine types, planter types, I mean, we're open to any and all questions you might have. It doesn't necessarily have to pertain to exactly what we shared today. Well, if not, again, I think the bulk of the folks we're talking to today are probably down in the Missouri area. It sounds like we have somebody from North Carolina. Great, thank you for joining. Just wanted to drop a quick note of our service area hub locations. So we've got 7 throughout the country, strategically placed, we feel, to serve the needs of local growers there. So closer to any one of these distribution centers, please let us know. Corey mentioned earlier, and we mean it, if you guys are willing and allow us to come out and visit your operation, we'd love to do that. me especially, I'm the farmer in this whole thing for Hempton, and so anything I can do to see what maybe people are doing different to manage their costs more aggressively, whether it's through machines or mechanization or whatever it might be, love to come down and take a look. That's easier said than done right now in this climate I get when a lot of us are on restrictions, but if these things lift, would love to get together on site later this year. Again, we'll close with the same slide as the other webinar. So again, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to me. If I can't answer them, I will definitely get it to somebody on our team who can. You see my email there as well as my personal cell phone number, so don't hesitate to reach out if you do have any questions.